Okay, good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us. I guess I should say good afternoon. And I just wanted to thank you for joining us. And I see that Carol Brzezicki is here. Carol, did you want to say hello and say something to the group?
Sure. Good morning. I just want to say good afternoon. And I just want to just say this is our first session on Zoom. So Blake, you'll have to just allow us a little bit of grace. And I'm a little bit scared. I'm a little bit scared of that because if it's more complicated than a coffee pot, then it's real complicated for me. And I just want to say thank you to Carolyn. Carolyn is online and she has just been so supportive. And during this process, we're really excited about that. This is our first Zoom opportunity during National Indigenous Day. So I just want to say thank you to Blake. Thank you for being so willing, and thank you for your wonderful heart and just a willingness to be able to come and share who the Métis Settlements of Alberta are. So thank you for that, Blake. And so maybe we'll just have you do your presentation. And you're good with Q&A at the end or as we go along?
I'm okay with either or, but some of the questions I'm quite long-winded in terms of answer. So if those
okay.
if they want to, we can hopefully maybe go through the presentation, and if you have a pen and paper handy, make a note on some of the chapters, and then we can return to any aspect of that.
Excellent, thank you. And again, thank you very much for coming out. So I'll hand it over to you.
Can I make one quick little note just before we get started? So if people do have questions, they can either put them down in the chat box, which is down below at the bottom of your screen, or you can see there's a little reaction button over at the bottom bar, and you can raise your hand or give a little indication that you'd like to speak, and we'll get to you. Okay, and so I will turn it over to Blake. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here today, and happy National Aboriginal Week. It's a fantastic week, I think, for all of us, not only to learn, but to be really inspired by not only the history of this province, but the history of this land that extends so deeply into the very roots of the soil that we sometimes, to be frank, take for granted. And I think that the history here in Alberta, when I was first encountering it, I was one of the management directors for what was known as Fort George in Buckingham House. It's a provincial historic site. And when I was doing that, I found many Albertans don't know very much about the deep history that the Métis people have in this province, or even the unique characteristics about this province. And Alberta is more unique than most in the fact that it's the only place where there are Métis settlements that currently remain. And that's a beautiful story that I'm here to talk to you folks about today, and hope that you can not only find pride as Albertans in this history, but also find ways that we can not only accelerate our own learning for other Indigenous groups, but also find better ways to support our communities here in Alberta. So without any further ado, I hope everyone can see the Alberta Métis Settlements Learning Resource screen. Can you folks see that? Excellent. Okay, I see lots of nods. So we're going to go through it. There's one portion that also has a video, mainly because I like to encourage folks to witness and listen to the stories and perspectives of our elders. And we've been very, very, very grateful to have had a very significant event captured on record in the Métis settlements that we'll go through here soon. But without any further ado, I'll go through who we are. So the purpose of this learning resource, hopefully, is to provide you folks with a really good understanding about who Métis people are, as well as an overview of the unique history within Western Canada. To understand Métis people is to understand Western Canada, to understand the story that is not only stems from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, the Northwest Territories, and parts of British Columbia, but it also encompasses huge pivot points for the country, nationally and internationally. So Métis people, we've been able to influence not only local histories, but international histories. And we'll go through that a little bit today as well. We also want to talk about the stories of struggle, triumph, and success that led to the unique evolution of these Métis settlements that I'm so grateful to have call Fishing Lake my home. Fishing Lake Métis Settlement is one of the settlements we'll be reviewing today. I'm a direct descendant of the original founder of that settlement and many of the movements within the past during the 20s and 30s of this work. Additionally, we want to highlight the path forward for Métis people based on the lessons learned from not only the past leadership, but also past experiences of governance and sustainability. We're in a new chapter these days, and we'll talk a little bit about where the Métis people are uniquely positioned today to make our country a better place. So a little background. So these are actually where the Métis settlements are located. Many of you folks might actually have been very, very, very close within range to a settlement. But the unique thing about settlements is they're just on the cusp of being in the back bush, I guess you could say, of many of the most popular sites in Alberta. You might know St. Paul, Alberta. That's where many of the settlements are located, as well as the Tri-Settlement region, which is near Slave Lake. I'm sure many people are familiar with the health centers there. We recently helped establish the health center in High Prairie. There was a town of High Prairie where we actually donated land where that current hospital sits. So with over 100,000 Métis people living in the province, Alberta is home to actually the largest Métis population in the country. And this isn't just happenstance. This is for a really unique reason that we're going to talk about today. Additionally, Canada is the only province with recognized land-based Métis people through provincial statute. And that's a unique problem that stems back to jurisdictional disputes between the province and the federal government. But long story short, the province of Alberta, through an act of the provincial legislature, was able to establish 12 communities, and today 8 remain. These land-based communities represent approximately 1.25 million acres of land, so that's about the size of Prince Edward Island, the province. And we also represent the largest privately held land in the province of Alberta, next to the Crown and to what is known as Ducks Unlimited, which is it's a conservation organization. And so we occupy a great deal of land in Alberta, and it's collectively held, which is a unique point. Reserves are established under the Indian Act and are held individually, but their land title is ultimately held by the Crown. Métis settlements are held by the Métis settlements in fee simple title, which is a huge benefit as Aboriginal people to own land and to be able to access that land and hold that land for future generations. The Provincial Métis Settlements Act provides some basic frameworks for land management, membership, and local government for the 8 Métis settlements. And most of these people who live on the settlements have been able to not only continue our culture, but have it actually evolve and thrive, I think, into a unique 21st century Métis identity, which I celebrate. I think many Métis people across the province celebrate. And we continue to influence every single day the perspectives of Métis. So Métis people have traditionally survived through trapping, farming, ranching, fishing, hunting, and working in industry. We also have our own unique language, which is Machif, which is it's a spectrum. When we say Machif, we're really meaning a spectrum of language. It stems from Cree, or what could be another Indigenous language like Soto or Ojibwe, and sometimes Dene, to an end of that spectrum, which is either French or English. And so between there is a mix of diversity on the types of languages our people speak. And the further east you go, for example, Manitoba, you can imagine their Machif is far more Francophone. And here in Alberta, our Machif is very Cree, highly Cree-centric. So who are the Métis? This is a huge question politically. I failed to mention, but I'm actually the national director for the Métis Settlements in Ottawa. And this is a question we get asked almost every day, a 24/7 question, is who are the Métis? And I hope to be able to provide some clarity to this, but it's no different than any culture in the world. And I'll put that in perspective in a moment. But the Métis people were a cultural group, political group, and in many instances, folks who aren't Métis have attempted to apply their own definition. But to put it simply, as early as 1634, Samuel de Champlain, a member of New France, said, "Our young men will marry your daughters and will become one people." It was really that inspiration that led to the modern Métis people, which really flourished during the fur trade. And the fur trade was the catalyst, the birthplace, the cradle of where Métisism and the Métis identity was birthed. And so the Métis is a distinct cultural group, like any cultural group, it is a combination of two or more other cultures. And what I mean by that is, if any folks here are familiar with anthropology, or what we like to call, I failed to recognize the word right now, but the origins of any culture is actually the combination of one or more cultures. Let's use another example, for instance. The French culture in France is actually a combination of two different cultures, sometimes three or four, but they're a combination of the Latin culture as introduced to that region by the Romans, and actually the Gaelic cultures and the cultures present near the Gaelic region, which is Gaul. So those cultures are actually two different regions coming together to make today the modern French people who have the French language. And that was a combination of two other cultures. And every culture in the world is like that. Métis people aren't the only mixed, post-contact mixed group or culture in North America post-contact. You might be familiar with the Cherokee Nation, is the largest indigenous nation in North America by membership. They're very large. They're actually a post-contact nation too. They formerly were known as the Mississippi Sauk, the Creeks of the Mississippi area, and the Creeks of the Mississippi transformed into the Cherokee Nation after they came into contact with the American identity. And so that's a really unique thing. And so here in North America's fur trade culture, the Métis were a combination of these groups here, societies which were French, English, Scottish, and many indigenous people, including the Mohawk, Cree, Saulteaux. We talk about others, including the Dene as well. These groups mixed into a cultural foundation, which today that foundation has been able to essentially create cultural aspects on top of it, which create the modern identity of Métis today. So simply put, the Métis are not simply mixed people. They are people who have mixed heritage, but form a unique culture today, a whole unique culture, just like any other culture in the world, how it forms its identity. It's based on the fact of mixedness and then builds, and that's all cultures. Not all Métis people are from or directly related to the Red River families. So this is a unique misunderstanding many folks have, is we like to concentrate all of our energy on understanding the Red River. But the only reason why we do that is because most Western literature actually focuses on contact with Métis at the Red River, because Ontario and Quebec are, of course, closer to Manitoba than they are to Alberta. So if you were from Ontario or Quebec, where many folks are from, when they're writing and engaging with Métis, it's in reference to the Red River. But we have to know that Métis people expand a huge territory, not only from the Red River, but all the way west, parts of the United States, and even into the Northwest Territories and parts of British Columbia. As far as the fur trade went, the Métis people went as well. We are one of the most mobile groups in North America, combining traditions of the fur trade and Western traditions of transportation, as well as Cree and Ojibwe canoes. We merged these technologies and we're able to create faster, bigger ways of getting into the West. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And we call that Rupert's Land. So if you have time later today, you can look at Rupert's Land and see how large Rupert's Land is. Rupert's Land is the land where Métis people have much of their cultural foundation. So some non-status Aboriginal peoples and others unconnected to contemporary Métis society also adopt the Métis identity, although this remains controversial, mainly because these folks are more likely non-status Aboriginal people, meaning that they don't have a necessary connection to the fur trade or to those families associated with the Métis culture, but are of mixed heritage. And the word Métis in French means mixedness. So there's a misunderstanding there. But as the Dean of the University of Alberta, he has a very good book called Métis. He distinguishes these two groups as capital M Métis and little m Métis. The capital M means in reference to the cultural group of the Métis, and the little m refers to those persons who are of mixed heritage, which is different and distinct than Métis persons. Many of those people living in urban centers, especially during the time of what we call the road allowance, ended up assimilating into the Euro-Canadian society, to the point their descendants no longer recognize themselves Métis. And this is an unfortunate fact about our history and our experience of colonization as Métis people, is unlike First Nations, who were recognized very early on as a distinct society, the Métis were enfranchised, meaning that they were dealt with as regular Canadians, and their identity was washed away. And over time, due to shame and prejudice, members of the Métis society were no longer identified as Métis in fear of being prejudiced against, and so began to bury that identity and began a very dark age for our people. In other places like Northern Alberta, however, more rural and isolated communities have survived culturally, and that includes the Métis Settlements. We're a unique cultural example of where that history of colonization didn't necessarily creep in so fast because we were able to be shielded by our distance from the east. Today, the Paoli test is the current legal framework, which was recognized through the Supreme Court as the test of Métis rights, and today we attempt to navigate through that system today. You might be familiar with many of the Métis cultural aspects. Many actors, athletes, and poets, of course, are part of our beautiful culture. Just to name a few, we have Tantu Cardinal from Paddle Prairie Métis Settlement, who was a very famous actress. We also have Sheldon Shure for those NHL fans. He's from Fishing Lake. He's a neighbor of mine, actually. We have a great deal of folks who've been able to participate and contribute not only to Alberta society, but to Canadian society writ large. And one of the most recognizable symbols of the Métis is the sash. And today we don't have enough time to go over the sash teachings, but essentially it is the origin story, the cultural and political foundation of our people is woven into that sash. It's a very beautiful story it tells. It tells our connection to the land as Aboriginal people. It tells about our connection to our ancestors as a nation. And it also connects us to the Creator in many ways, and to the history of the foundation of our people. The fiddle and the Red River Jig are also famous examples of our culture. You might have noticed that at any of the Olympics more recently, we've had our cultural exposés there and across the country and even internationally. More recently, we've come into partnership with the government of Scotland, and we're participating with them and doing a cultural exchange as Scottish people make up a foundation, parts of the foundation of our identity today. And we hope to share that, and to continue to share that kinship, not only with our First Nations brothers and sisters, but with our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters across the ocean as well. So now to go into the history. Where do the Métis people come from? Well, the foundation, if you can imagine our culture as a tree and growing from the roots up, we're going to start here. The seed that helps to create our people is really the fur trade. So the Métis people ended up playing a critical, major, and unreplaceable role during the fur trade and the development of the Northwest and the Hudson's Bay companies. Those two companies were the companies who competed here in North America, not only for land claims, but more particularly for the resource wealth that it presented. The Hudson's Bay Company was a company that was established by the Crown in 1670 by an act of the British Parliament. It was also given a land claim known as Rupert's Land, to which it was allowed to occupy and to trade. This becomes a major dispute later on in our history, to which we'll get to. In response to the violent treatment of the Hudson's Bay Company to Métis and First Nations people, Métis, Scottish, and First Nations people created their own company, known as the Northwest Company. It was deemed illegal by the British government and ended up becoming one of the greatest competitors to the Hudson's Bay Company, and ended up creating massive tensions. But long story short, the Hudson's Bay Company did merge the two by purchasing the Northwest Company in 1821, leading to the beginning of a dark age for the Hudson's Bay Company. Prior to that time, the Hudson's Bay Company was known relatively as a peaceful company that was trading very fairly with many people. This is the time when the company really attempts to take back its power, and where all the scary stories of colonialism really begin to perpetuate, and standards of health for Indigenous people begin to plummet. So the intermarrying of these mixed families, particularly French, and I should say French because the French were the first European nation to have a proper land claim here in North America until the British defeated them in the War of New France. But it was highly encouraged by the French to intermarry with First Nations, and this was for two reasons. One, to Christianize the population, but two, to also bring French claim to the region. They wanted to find a way to have the Francophone people part and parcel of this land, and this stems back to centuries of the French treatment of how they were able to make settlements across Europe. So this was no different than their experience in Europe. Very different than the British. The British take a very different approach. They do not believe that intermarriage with First Nations is appropriate, which leads to today why such a predominant amount of Métis people are of French descent. So examples of Métis communities that flourished in Alberta that were way prior to the Red River even being established as a settlement were fertile locations known as Fort Chipewyan in 1778, Fort Vermilion, 79, and Lac La Biche Mission, 1785. Later on, the Métis people also helped to establish Lake St. Anne. It's a very beautiful pilgrimage site that many of us still go on today. And St. Albert, you folks might be familiar with that. It's not too far from where we are here at Edmonton today. And St. Paul de Métis. St. Paul de Métis is now known as St. Paul, Alberta. Other contemporary communities are Grouard, which was going to be at one point the capital of this province, and Carcajou, in large part because they were very large centers of Métis people and commerce. So let's back up a little bit. So prior to the Métis people and the introduction of Western peoples, what was here before colonization, let's say? Here across the Great Plains, there was many confederacies across North America. And these confederacies became the model of Canadian Confederacy and American Confederacy. In North America, it is where the political identity of Confederacy began. And it's spread across the world today, including the European Union has adopted Confederacy. So many people think that when contact began, it was a one-way street where Indigenous people were the only ones doing the learning. That's not correct. In many, many, many instances, it was Indigenous people who were contributing to Western knowledge. And one of those was through political identities. We were able to demonstrate to British and French people that Confederacy was actually a much better way of governing lands, to which they later on adopted and are today across the world adopting. So Métis were actually members of what was called the Iron Confederacy. The Iron Confederacy extends from the James Bay, Hudson's Bay, where the Hudson's Bay Company was established, all the way west to where Alberta is today. It was a huge piece of political territory controlled in predominant part by the Cree. But of course, there was other members of the Confederacy, including the Métis. We have evidence of, and Assiniboine and Saulteaux. Later on, we did incorporate the Dene as well. But during what was known as the Blood Confederacy and Iron Confederacy Wars, it ended this history. We won't get into that too much today. But examples of where this Confederacy reacted to many instances of bad behavior in the Plains was the first instance that was recorded by the West was the Pemmican Wars. So the Pemmican Wars was an instance where non-Indigenous people attempted to starve out a group of folks, which led to what was known as the Pemmican Wars, where Indigenous people reacted, took back their food, and made a claim against colonization, to where a treaty was born. The French and the British made a treaty stating that they will not enter the West past where Manitoba line is today. They would not enter that territory. And that promise was fulfilled for nearly 100 years until Canada became a country and broke that agreement. Again, in the victory of Frog Plain, there was another instance of conflict where the Iron Confederacy again defended its territorial integrity. And then finally, the last two resistances, which most Canadians are well familiar with, which is the Red River Resistance and the Northwest Resistance. We'll go over that a little bit today as well. But that essentially began the beginning of the Métis people's dark age and the beginning of Canadian colonialism across Canada, to which we still have the effects today. And health organizations, of course, such as AHS, have been major supports and understanding intergenerational trauma from these times. We'll go here. So the Iron Confederacy, this is one of the first depictions of the Iron Confederacy. This was actually a fur trader who took this quick sketch. It was a mixture of many Indigenous people with separate provincial legislators, quote unquote, which were their own little organizations like the Cree group, the Saulteaux group, and the Métis group. But they all together formed this unique protected area known as the Iron Confederacy. Similar to the Blood tribes today in southern Alberta, they are still a confederacy, which is remarkable. So the resistance era and the story of Canada. So Canada begins to really dispute its intentions, the British intentions in North America. So the British Crown and the Canadian government, which is Dominion at the time, begin to clearly conflict over jurisdiction. Canada wants to be able to pursue more resource. Britain says you can't do that, Canada, mainly because we have this agreement, this thing called the Royal Proclamation, which prohibits us, this promise to Indigenous people that we won't take their land. Canada disputes that and attempts to create its own dominion, which it does. So the Hudson's Bay Company is asked to sell its land. So you'll see here, if you can you see my pointer by chance? Yeah, you'll see here, this is what we call Rupert's Land. This is the entire territory where the Iron Confederacy is working in, including the Northwest Territory. You can see it's a massive territory, massive amount of land. This is where all the resources are coming from during the fur trade, is Rupert's Land. So then we have what was known as the Dominion of Ontario, and the Dominion of Quebec, and then the Dominion of British Columbia. These areas over here become their own little country, become their own dominion all by themselves, making it so that Canada as a dominion and British Columbia as a dominion are the only two British dominions left, with the exception of Newfoundland, which doesn't join Canada until 1949. So we see that the original grant by King Charles II in 1670 is given to Canada, and that's a dispute for everybody, because the agreement in Rupert's Land was that the Hudson's Bay Company was only there for the purpose of resources and sharing, not to settle or occupy. And that was a very, very serious dispute between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, which led to the final rebellion. So many people living in Rupert's Land leading up to the 1867, which is the date to which Canada is created, particularly in the Red River, which is here, very, very close to Ontario, were Métis. And so they then were known as half-breeds as a way as a derogatory term to ensure that they were treated dissatisfactorily. The Métis occupied small areas of land. And we also understood this land to be held freely amongst the members of the Iron Confederacy in a nomadic tradition. So the question is, why resist to Canada? If the Métis people were participating in trade so much with with Europeans, why is this an issue? Well, one of the biggest issues was actually the negotiations of the transfer of Rupert's Land, but also what would become these instances, which was the Canadian Pacific Railway. This was a promise that Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, created with British Columbia. He said, in order for these two dominions to marry, we need to have a way to connect the two. And he said, we will make a country with two bands of steel. But to get from Ontario to British Columbia, you had to go through the Iron Confederacy. A big problem. So it essentially creates a situation where the Métis people are forced to resist. The fur and buffalo meat trades were opened up to private Métis and non-Métis traders, bringing a new threat of European colonists seeking to profit and disenfranchise the Métis from their traditional lands. And by the late 1870s, the plains and traditional lands were facing disaster, with the bison herds virtually eliminated, leaving people to the brink of starvation. So in Canada's attempt to settle the West, their greatest strategy is not to use war. Canada has a very small army. They don't have a general. They can fight. And so Canada attempts to use the railroad, and they attempt to use starvation as a tactic to force Indigenous people to sign things like a treaty agreement, which would lead First Nations to break the treaty and attempt to rebel against Canada as well, which is what happened in Frog Lake. By the 1670s, the plains and traditional lands were facing, we went through that. There was Métis to note that were pro-union, that said we should join Canada, we shouldn't stop them. However, they weren't the majority, and it did lead to two resistances. Many of you folks are probably familiar with this gentleman, Louis Riel. He was a formally educated person in Montreal, and he understood very well what Canada's intent was. As a native Manitoban as well, he understood the threat to the Métis people and to Indigenous people across the West. And he was able to spread that message to many people and was able to spread that message so quickly to create a large enough resistance to stop Canada. So they seized Fort Garry in 1869 after Canada's creation in 1867 and established a provisional government. A provisional government means a government to create a government because there is no other government. He demanded the right to vote, land laws, and the use of English and French as official languages. Prior to this, Francophones were very, very disenfranchised. Francophones were not liked by people of Ontario and were not liked by Canadians writ large. So Louis Riel, being a Francophone speaker himself, was actually the person who protected the French language in our Constitution today. It was not Quebecois, it was actually Métis people who were to protect the French language. This would lead as well to official languages, two official churches as well. Prior to Louis Riel, the law in Canada was you must be Protestant, with the exception of some Catholic missions in Quebec. He then made it possible for Catholic and Protestant schooling across the country. So the newly formed Canadian Federation, which is the second confederacy that is non-Aboriginal, which is very unique for the world, a new kind of government, saw its first resistance. And this resistance was brought on by Canadian surveyors. So Canadian surveyors start to enter the West and break that agreement we talked about, where they said they wouldn't settle the West. And so Louis Riel says, what are you doing? You can't do this. And they negotiate. So resulting from that battle at Red River was actually a political victory for the Métis, but it resulted in a social loss by the Métis. And this is where the law in Canada becomes something as a weapon to the Métis people. So Manitoba joins Confederacy. It is the Métis province. It states in that agreement that the Métis people will govern Manitoba exclusively until our population reaches the majority of the province. This doesn't happen. Canada starts sending people in immediately, resulting in our population being overrun, and that population then being mistreated. So our Métis population begins to flee further west, fleeing threats, fleeing a massive amount of displacement. We start going into Saskatchewan and Alberta, where there's already existing Métis communities that we can flee to. So that happens, and these demands create the Manitoba Act, and would also eventually create Alberta and Saskatchewan. Riel, now wanted for treason by the Canadian government, stands to be put on trial for the execution of someone named Thomas Scott. So Thomas Scott was the Canadian Governor General who was appointed the Governor General of Rupert's Land and Manitoba, against the advice of the Red River Métis. He illegally entered and broke that agreement between the two parties and was trialed by the Métis people and executed. This led to essentially Sir John A. Macdonald having a personal hate for Louis Riel, and Louis Riel flees to the United States. So First Nations people are dealt with by means of treaty. So the Royal Proclamation sets up a system for for British colonization in North America. It says that there must be consent, that Indigenous people must consent to their surrender of land. And how Canada interprets that is, well, we can do it one of many ways. They agree to do it by treaty for First Nations people. They say, let's split up the groups, the Iron Confederacy. So they split up the Iron Confederacy into different treaty groups. And then they treat the Métis as if they aren't people at all. And this becomes a very terrible time for us. Following the treaties, the historic treaties, which the government of Canada's perspective is that those are cede and surrender agreements. Indigenous people will dispute that greatly, and it's likely that the Indigenous groups are more correct in their interpretation of the treaties than Canada is. But Canada's purpose of treaty was to cede and surrender that land through the consent. So we have that take place, and the Iron Confederacy then is dismantled, and those land claims become Canada. We start to split up Rupert's Land and the Northwest Territories into treaty zones, and leaving the Métis without any rightful claim. However, there's Métis people who are very clever and smart and know the legal system, and they say, you can't do this, Canada. And Canada invents then a new system called script, which are mini baby treaties. They're individual treaties. So they're treaties between individuals rather than nations. And so these are called script. So script was a system of having the Métis surrender their land rights in exchange for land itself, which was the script coupon, or a payment of $100 or so, $120 in lieu of their land claim. This doesn't work. In 2013, the Supreme Court of Canada rules that it was illegal for Canada to transfer that land, and it failed to transfer any land under the Manitoba Act. So today, the Métis people of Manitoba are negotiating their rightful land claims there, and will likely be the second place where Métis people will have their land returned. In Alberta, that's already taken place, which is very, very good. Of course, we have lots of work to continue to do, and we'll continue to do that. So now the resistances themselves, the second resistance. So Riel is asked to return to Saskatchewan by way of invitation by a gentleman named President Gabriel Dumont, who was the president of the Provisional Government of Saskatchewan. And he passes a 10-point Métis Revolutionary Bill of Rights, and he demands Canada accept it. However, Canada rejects this and states that it would rather, at this time, use force. So Canada's queen at the time, known as Queen Victoria, appoints someone named General Middleton. General Middleton is a famous general in Britain. He was responsible for helping to put down the revolts by the Mohawk nations. He was also responsible for assisting Britain in wars in England. He is now sent overseas here to Canada to help put down the Métis, famous general. They also send thousands of troops along with it. So unlike the first resistance, Canada had no troops. So it had to agree with the Métis' demands. Now Canada has an army and has something even more powerful, a new invention. Rather than using muskets like we were before, they bring with them a brand new weapon that Queen Victoria helps to create in her own factory, which I'd like to ask you folks if you know what it is, but I think this is a hard setting to do it. But it's the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun is first used in North America against Indigenous people. So the Gatling gun essentially leads to the loss of Métis people in Batoche. If you visit Batoche today in Saskatchewan, the interpreters show you where the bullets are. And there's the church was actually shot, which led to a huge conflict between the Catholic Church in Canada for a great number of years, but they've relatively fixed that. So this marked the beginning of a bloody 5-month battle where hundreds of people were killed and ultimately the mass exodus of Métis families westward. This was Canada's last stand in terms of their negotiation with Métis. They want to put down the Métis one people once and for all, and this was their way. It also led to the largest mass execution in Canadian history. So Riel would be hanged in Regina illegally on November 16th, 1885. So Sir John A. Macdonald had a personal vendetta against Louis Riel for the embarrassing loss in the Manitoba Act, the embarrassing negotiations. He thought that was a loss by Canada because you're not supposed to negotiate with threats like this. So he was understood by his own peers as more cowardly. So in order to essentially find a way to restore his own faith, he creates an illegal court in Regina. He uses the RCMP, at the time the Northwest Mounted Police Barracks, and establishes by order of council a court, which he then appoints his own jury. And the jury, with less than 10 days, finds Louis Riel guilty and has him hanged for treason, along with 12 other First Nations people, including 6 chiefs. So here was the members of the provisional government in 1869. These members are founders of a political movement that is still existing today. But what happened after the resistance era? So this would become the terrible dark ages for the Métis people. This would lead to the greatest disenfranchisement of wealth, land, and culture by our people, to which we are still recovering. Much of this history isn't too far behind us. And it wasn't until 1961 where Indigenous people actually got the right to vote. All right. Oops. So one of the most peaceful, we'll go back one more time. So Métis people were largely disliked and alienated by Canadians. If you go to Ontario today, there's still some curriculum books that discuss the Métis as quote unquote traitors. We're working with the governments of Ontario, of course, today to remedy that problem. And we're finding many ways to try to have more understanding with non-Indigenous people as to why the Métis people defended what they thought was theirs. Now, St. Paul de Métis. This was the Catholic Church's way of protecting us in some instance. So the Catholic Church found benefit in the Métis people, and they always thought that the Métis people, as good Catholics, would be able to create a new France in the West. That doesn't go very well. But there is one gentleman in particular named Father Albert Lacombe, who who knew Cree even and was able to communicate in the language of Indigenous people and sympathized greatly with the Métis. He understood what was happening in many ways. However, what he proposed was very much in the interest of the church, but it still provided a home for Métis people. What we've seen was the creation of St. Paul de Métis, the first federal Métis reserve, today known as St. Paul. It was terminated in 1905 upon the creation of the province of Alberta. Following that, it opened up the province of Alberta to public homesteading, resulting again in upwards of 60% land loss by Indigenous people. So here's St. Paul de Métis. That's where my family is from, actually. This is one of our family photos. This is right where the church stands today. The road allowance era. This is the era that we're still recovering from, and many folks in the AHS, I believe, can play a role in undoing this unfortunate historic trauma. Not only trauma dealt to their identity, but trauma dealt to their direct health, including health care issues of chronic illness, such as heart and lung illness, which are predominantly Métis issues today. The Métis population actually in Canada is the population that represents the highest rate of chronic illness. It's brought on by this time. So the road allowance era is for the Métis settlements from 1900 to 1938, but for Métis people, other Métis people across the country, it never ends for them. They still are landless today. So the road allowance era ends for the Métis settlements in 1938, and it was created in many part to assist the Métis people from not dying, was the long story short. There was a commission called the Ewing Commission, which is a commission of the Alberta government related to the Métis people's health. So how did we get to that point? How do we get from understanding the Métis people's health conditions to the creation of settlements? So the North Central Alberta became a refuge for many Métis people in the 1900s, becoming a transition zone between the prairie farmland and heavy bush area of the commercial forest belt, northern Alberta, and was able to support all classes of Métis. This is a unique place here in Alberta. Alberta is home to one of the most unique histories and most unique biodiversities, where we can actually have the Métis people who lived across Canada find a way to transition their skills while being present here. The Dominion of Canada didn't really care too much about northern Alberta at this time either. There was no discovery of oil yet, and northern Alberta was, for all intents and purposes, useless land. Too much water, you can't get into it, useless. So they allow Métis people access to northern Alberta. Additionally, Métis people begin to organize again in Fishing Lake, where I'm from. My great-great-grandfather named Charlie Delorme begins to petition Métis people and demand that we have access to land so that we can farm and to be able to build our own schools and churches so that we can continue to live a decent life. None of this could have been done without the participation of this man, however, Joseph Dion. He was an educated, enfranchised Indian, meaning that by force, Canada forcefully had him surrender his Indian status, quote unquote, in exchange for the ability to get formally educated. It was understood at the time that if you were a woman marrying a man, you would surrender as well your Indian rights. And there was many ways Aboriginal people could lose their rights by way of participation in non-Indigenous society. So Joseph Dion, he grew up in a place called Kihiwin First Nations, right beside St. Paul de Métis, and he witnessed the abuse. So he was also the writer of the St. Paul Journal, and he wasn't quiet about this. And he very much overtly discussed the atrocities he witnessed and became a huge champion for Indigenous people across this province, and is today one of the most remarkable Albertans in history. He was also recognized by the Pope. Pope Pius XVI actually awarded him the Golden Standard of Piety upon his death. The founding of Alberta's Métis settlements. So under the leadership of Charlie Delorme and Dudonné Collins, informal meetings began to propose a reserve that would set aside exclusively for the Métis people. Métis people at this time now have no land or access to land because St. Paul de Métis is extinguished. So there's a really good resource book you can learn for all of this. It's called The 1.5 Men. It's one of my favorite books by Murray Dobbin. It also has a foreword by Marie Campbell. Marie Campbell is a remarkable Métis elder, scholar, writer. It's a great resource to learn about this true history of the Métis and the real experiences. I really do recommend that people pick up the more recent edition of Marie Campbell's book. It goes into her experiences with the RCMP that were in previous editions excluded. because of a legal threat by the RCMP, but have now been included in her new rendition. I have to warn, though, it is a very triggering book. It does discuss sexual violence in many ways, and she's open about that experience. But it is unfortunate what happened there. These two gentlemen here are Jim Brady and Malcolm Norris. Many other Albertans may know them because of their participation in large events like the American Indian Movement or the creation of the Communist Party of Canada and the Communist Party of Alberta. Communism, of course, plays a huge role during this time. Before the Cold War, communism is understood as a regular political system. There's no propaganda to discuss communism as a bad thing. So in Canada, the ideas of socialism and communism are actually encouraged. And so these gentlemen, through that mandate, create the settlements in a unique way, a social structure very similarly. So we'll skip through this stuff for now. We went through it a little bit just because of time. So the Ewan Commission was the commission by Alberta that these gentlemen, including 3 other folks, assisted in lobbying the government to say, if you don't believe the problems of the Métis are real, you should investigate them yourselves. And so Alberta does and finds a deplorable condition. However, Alberta cites that there's a unique problem here, that Canada is technically the jurisdiction that's supposed to be helping Métis people, not Alberta, not the provinces. But Canada says, no, provinces, Métis people are fully enfranchised, they sign script, so they're regular Canadians, so treat them as such. This is difficult to do, mainly because non-Indigenous Canadians do not want Métis people living in their communities. So they have a problem. What do they do with the Métis? The Ewan Commission, long story short, recommends that we will end the road allowance and have the Métis people granted colonies. These 12 Métis colonies would be the first instances of this, and the Métis people would be given complete access, exclusive access to these 12 colonies. These 12 colonies were established in northern Alberta. Land they discussed was prior not useful land. It elects their own governing council for their first time, so Métis people now have their own councils. However, the paternalism that Alberta displays here is obvious because they also appoint what is known as a supervisor on top of the governing council. So the governing council, although elected, has no ability to actually create laws or has no ability to do anything other than recommend to the supervisor actions, which is very akin to the Indian agent under the Indian Act. So Alberta's Métis move home. So this becomes a beautiful story, the beginning of something really beautiful, where Métis people now have a legal protection for the first time in Canadian history, where they can go into a place and not be segregated, or not be, although segregated, well, they won't be abused. At the time, you have to imagine the road allowance was terrible for them. They were known as traders. They weren't permitted on reserves, and they had no jurisdiction to care for them. There was the papers at the time in Ontario called the Métis the half-breed gypsies, and this was a terrible, terrible time that the Métis people endured. So this, for many families, was the first opportunity to regain a basic life. So we'll go over some of those settlements today. There's the Buffalo Lake Métis settlement. It's a beautiful colony. We used to call them colonies. Sorry, the beautiful settlement. They're 35,000 hectares. It was originally known as the Beaver River Métis Colony number 7, which is also known as Kikino. These two settlements were actually divided after World War II. East Prairie Métis settlement in the Swan Hills, very beautiful as well. It is Big Lakes County. The population is under 1,000. This is the community known for the wildland firefighters. You might have heard last year, the Métis settlements, we deployed the wildland firefighters to assist Quebec in their wildfires. We have one of the best trained fire crews in the world, and they're stationed here in Alberta in East Prairie. The Elizabeth Métis settlement, named after Joe F. Dion's wife, actually, Elizabeth Dion. It is located just beside my community, north of Fishing Lake. You might know some of the beautiful arts that come out of there. They also offer some community services, including counseling and other home care options for elders. They also do other things, including health, nutrition, and parental involvement at some of their care centers. Fishing Lake, where I'm from, is the most beautiful Métis settlement. No, I'm just kidding. It's my home. It's the only historic Métis settlement in the sense that all the other Métis settlements were actually established by the Alberta government. in the exception of Fishing Lake. Fishing Lake was a historic Métis place that ended up becoming recognized, mainly because it was already established. There was already people living there in homes, cabins, roads, things like this. So Canada or Alberta simply recognized it. The Gift Lake Métis Settlement, also formerly known as Uticuma Métis Settlement, is a beautiful settlement as well. It's today known as one of our most pristine settlements. It's actually the settlement with the best Cree language in Western Canada. 1 in every 2 Métis people can speak Cree there today, including populations under 11. So it's an impressive situation we have there. Unfortunately, that number is declining, but we hope to work with Alberta Education and Canadian governments to help support that enhancement before it's too late. Kikino Métis Settlement, home of the Accord, it's also known as. The Accord is something that ended the Betterment Act, which ended the supervisors, and this is where that agreement was signed. Paddle Prairie, unfortunately, you might have recently heard that last year we had a major forest fire that went through this community. We lost upwards of 15 homes and are still dealing with the impacts from that fire last year. The Peavine Métis Settlement, you'll see here. It's a beautiful Métis settlement as well. It's the settlement that is probably the most agriculturally rich Métis settlement today, with some of the best lands. It's also the settlement that is known as our sports settlement. It's won international awards in baseball for a long time, and they've played against Team Canada, even Team USA in previous. So what happened after 1938? Well, our leadership became more and more dissatisfied with the treatment of the supervisors. So they unite under what is known as the Federation in 1975. In 1975, this federation takes on a lawsuit against the Alberta government, claiming that the Alberta government has stolen money from our oil assets. And it was proven or accepted by Alberta that that was the case, that they did in fact do that. But the settlement agreement that was to be pursuant to that problem wasn't just the money back, but our people asked for jurisdiction, meaning we wanted to remove the supervisors to have a duly elected government and have that government represent our people for the first time. So in 1975, we proposed the first democratic situation on the settlements. Second, we proposed that we own the land in fee simple title, that we no longer lease our own land, that we have the dignity enough as the original stewards and landholders to hold that land and just pursue our own ventures. So that takes place, fast forward a little bit, and in 1979, our elders pursue a statement of principles to which we are just coming to the end of these 40 years, and we'll be renewing these principles. So I was gonna play a video, but I'll send you folks the link to this video, just considering time. I wanna leave time for questions. I see there's some questions in the comments that I wanna get to. So we'll just, I'll share this video. It's on YouTube as well. If you Google MSGC Elders Tribute, you'll be able to find it. It's a great video that discusses the creation of these principles. The Accord is what we're currently under with Alberta, which guarantees the things we just talked about, the land ownership and our own ability to govern. It creates the Métis Settlements General Council. It also creates a unique central government, which this is, the Métis Settlements General Council. So this begins a whole process of trying to get recognized now by Canada. So Alberta has now recognized the Métis settlements, but Canada still has not. And so that's what my job is actually. So fast forward here. So my job is to implement some of this work, is to negotiate with Canada. We won a huge Supreme Court case in 2016, which states that Canada does have a role and a primary role in negotiating with Métis people, especially Métis settlements. And so as we make the transition from provincial municipal-like bodies, which is the only kind of government the province can give us, we're now making the transition to full nationhood. And that's an exciting adventure, an exciting endeavor that Louis Riel, right from the beginning of the Manitoba Act, had wished for. And we're on the cusp of that, fulfilling over a 200-year mission. And I hope to pay as much respect and homage to those leaders as I can during these negotiations. These negotiations are held in confidentiality, but I'm happy to discuss them at any point with any of the members as we move forward in this work. We recently also negotiated our first Section 35 hunting rights. So Métis people are now protected by the Constitution for our purpose of harvesting, and I'm very proud of this negotiation. Métis people can now harvest across Alberta. and any undesignated crown lands. Conclusions and the path forward. So this is a big question. It's a question that lies with every Métis person and every Métis settlement member as to where we go next. And it's a question that I wish to investigate with the membership part and parcel. We have a lot of conflicting interests to date, including interests like defending the provincial arrangement, which of course we could continue to be provincial organizations, but it was really the true dream to advance to full nationhood. And I hope that as we continue to educate our members on what benefits that can have, including health benefits, it would be a very good opportunity for us. So now we can take some questions. I can't actually see the chat. If someone might be able to help me with that, where that chat lives.
Sure, Blake. I actually grabbed all of the questions for you. So the first question we had was the question about how many nations are in Alberta.
Oh, that's a very good question. Originally or today? Originally, actually, before the Iron Confederacy, this is a history that Indigenous people have to reconcile amongst ourselves, is the land that we're currently in Alberta used to be Dene land. Prior to the Iron Confederacy breaking a treaty we had with the Dene, it was actually the Dene who owned the land. That was approximately about 1690 that informal treaty took place between the Cree and the Dene. But the Cree actually broke that treaty and declared war against the Dene, resolving the Dene to having almost little to no land here in Alberta. But today, of course, we also see the Blackfoot Confederacy has moved north into southern Alberta. And so it depends when in time you ask that question. But today, we're okay saying there's 48 First Nations and 2 Métis nations, including the Métis Settlements unique nations. But it depends when that you mean.
Fabulous. The next question we asked was this about the highest rate of illness and wondering if that's above First Nations people.
Yeah, unfortunately, to be specific, I mean chronic illness, meaning those conditions, of course, that last and persist. Things like heart disease, lung disease are the most predominant. And we have some health information known as the Alberta or the Métis Settlements Health Assessment Phase 1 and 2 that we came into partnership with the Ministry of Alberta Health actually produce. The Métis Settlements particularly are the highest instance of all Métis across the country with that chronic illness. And that is a combination of not only inheritance, issues of inheritance and things like that, of things like diabetes, but also the kinds of foods that we're eating due to poverty.
Okay, question wondering, what is the best way for someone to find out if they have Métis ties?
So this is a great question. And like I was saying before, Métis people, you might have a great-great-grandparent who said, you know what, it's too difficult to try to be Métis because I'm going to lose my life if I tell people going around I'm Métis. And so today, many Métis people, and I encourage families to look into that history because we have to know that our grandparents were trying to protect us when they made that choice. They were trying to do the best they could to protect their children by saying they were French. But the Métis people, of course, have a long history. So the first place to start would be your genealogy. You may have a family member who's really good at genealogy. However, here at the Métis Settlements General Council, we can also assist you with that genealogy should we have in our database an existing lineage that can tie to your family. You can also go to our partner organization, the Métis Nation of Alberta, which is actually a separate and distinct group. There's 2 Métis groups in Alberta, the Métis Settlements General Council and the Métis Nation of Alberta. We're totally separate, you can imagine, because of that history, our history with Alberta. But it doesn't mean we're not relatives. You can go see their registry or our registry. We're willing to support anyone who comes forward.
Okay, and then the final question we've got before we run out of time is, how can the scripts be valid then when they've been proved as illegal or non-recognized?
That's a great question. So my job is to help negotiate the outcome of this, the illegal seizures of script. So script is now ruled illegal, meaning that all Métis people actually still have their Aboriginal rights, unceded Aboriginal rights, which is similar to British Columbia First Nations, similar to First Nations in the North, and similar to First Nations in Quebec, where there is no historic treaty, meaning that you have all rights that are granted to you by the Creator, including access to this land.
And then maybe something we can ask if you can follow up with us later that we can send out is asking if you have any good resources or books about understanding script. So maybe that's something we'll ask you to follow up on. But
yeah, there's lots of good literature. I actually have a reading syllabus. I teach a law class at McGill annually. They have a lecture series. I think they might have recorded it even, but I share a syllabus with the law students there. Some of it is quite technical, but lots of the historical aspects in it are very easy to follow. The issue of script is because it's such a recent overturn of the courts that most of that is in very legalistic language, and it's not in plain language. But there is some resources that are good, including just a quick one, that if you have a pen and paper, I mean, the one I talked about, the 1.5 Men, I think chapter 4, Dobbin talks about script and the procedures of script, but also the expert on script actually is here in Alberta. His name is Dr. Frank Tuff. So Dr. Frank Tuff, you Google him, he has lots of articles, not necessarily a book, but lots of articles on the issues of script and the fraudulent nature of script. He's also located at the University of Alberta. He's a public researcher. And you can access him as well. Any Albertan can. He is the foremost best scholar on script.
wonderful. Well, Blake, I think we've run out of time, but I want to thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. We've really, really appreciated it. And Carol, I don't know if there's anything you want to say before we say goodbye for this particular presentation.
Sure. Blake, of course, an hour is nowhere near long enough. And so we would, I'll throw out the invitation from the program to be able to invite you back to do your 4-hour. You have a 4-hour presentation, and I know you have a day presentation as well. But yeah, I know we have some people on from cultural competency, and we need to take advantage of you and you as a resource. So thank you again. Of course, as a member from PVON, I'm just so proud of the work that you guys do. So thank you for your continued work.
Thanks so much, Carol, and we're more than happy to assist. This information is it's a gift to the Métis people, but it's also a gift for all Albertans. We're more than happy to share it. It's part of each and every one of our histories. We didn't have time to go through it today, but Alberta is the only province to ever give back land, and it was to the Métis people. And it did so by promising that land in an amendment, the first amendment to Alberta's constitution, meaning that non-Indigenous Albertans and Indigenous Albertans, we have a very sacred constitutional obligation to uphold, and it's one that I take seriously, and I hope all Albertans take seriously.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, folks.
So we're going to be getting ready to move into our next session. We may have some people on the line who are going to be joining that as well, and you can stay right here. So that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Blake. And
thanks so much. You know how can you maybe end it for me? I'm not sure how I do that.
I think, let me see.
Get my assistant here too. She's better at this than I am.
I think if you go down to, you should be able to, on your view options, stop. I can stop your sharing. There you go. How's that?
Oh, almost. Oh, there we are. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, folks, and happy learning. And please feel free to email me if you have any other questions. My email box does fill up pretty quickly, so it sometimes takes me a month to get to them. But if it's a history question, I love history, and I'll probably answer it first. So see you, folks. Have a very good day.
Thank you.